Hey everyone, it's Lucky with Unfiltered Lucky. And today I want to talk about the Idaho 4 crimes. Now, for the past couple of weeks, we've been talking about a lot of the new information that's been coming out. And a lot of this information has not been favorable toward Bryan Kohberger. I think it's very important that we talk about all of the information. We've been asking for answers for a very long time. And now that all of this new information is coming out, there's a good possibility that a lot of our questions could be answered. So I approach it all with an open mind, and I want to see all of the information, whether it goes against Bryan Kohberger or not. Now, today I want to talk about something that I'm still struggling with when it comes to this suspect, and that is that something just seems off about Bryan Kohberger as the sole suspect in the Idaho 4 crimes. Things just don't seem to be adding up about this suspect as well as this investigation. So we've heard that Bryan Kohberger was being monitored by the feds back in Pennsylvania. We've seen this in text messages between Steve Gonsalves and an associate of Howard Bloom. And I've also heard this from people whose information is usually very reliable. So we've been hearing this for some time. And in my opinion, if the feds were monitoring Bryan Kohberger back in Pennsylvania before he ever moved to Washington, and of course before the Idaho 4 crimes occurred, that would add another twist to this investigation. There's a lot about this investigation into Bryan Kohberger as the sole suspect in the Idaho 4 crimes that doesn't really make sense. If this investigation was conducted in the way that law enforcement is telling us that it was, then there's a lot of pieces that don't seem to fit together. And we've talked about this in previous videos. But today, I want to begin in Pennsylvania before Bryan Kohberger moved to Pullman, Washington, and of course, before the Idaho 4 crimes even occurred. Now, we know that Bryan Kohberger graduated with his master's degree from DeSales University in Pennsylvania. And this would be in June of 2022, which is 5 months before the Idaho 4 crimes occurred. And we can assume that he had always planned on attending Washington State University for his PhD program, because in April of 2022, 2 months before he graduated, he interviewed with Pullman Police Department. Now, in one of these latest interviews, Steve Gonsalves said that he believed that Bryan Kohberger needed this internship with Pullman Police Department for his PhD program at Washington State. Now, we know that Bryan Kohberger did not get that position, and Bryan Kohberger would have been aware of that in April of 2022, 2 months before he graduated in June. So it seems as though if he needed this internship in order to fulfill the requirements for his PhD program at Washington State, and he was rejected, that he may look at some other colleges. But apparently he did not need this internship because he did enroll at Washington State University and he did begin his PhD program in August of 2022. It makes me wonder if the feds were already monitoring Bryan Kohberger in April of 2022 when he interviewed with Pullman Police Department. And maybe that's why he didn't get the position. Now, that might not have anything to do with it, but it does make me wonder if he didn't get the position because he was being monitored by the feds at that time. Because if they were monitoring him in Pennsylvania before he even moved to Pullman, Washington, then obviously they're going to be monitoring him in Pullman, Washington. So it makes me wonder when the feds began monitoring Bryan Kohberger. So Bryan Kohberger picks up his things and moves 2,500 miles across country from his hometown of Pennsylvania to Washington to begin his PhD program at Washington State University, knowing that he has been rejected from the Pullman Police Department. Now, he still chooses to go to Washington State University and he enrolls full time in the PhD program, and he's also working as a teacher's aide. Now, we also know that Bryan Kohberger was pulled over for minor traffic violations 2 times after he moved to Pullman, Washington in August of 2022. And in both of these traffic stops, there was body cam footage provided by both officers. And we'll get back into that here in a minute. But in the early morning hours of November 13th, 2022, the Idaho 4 crimes occur. And 4 students' lives are taken by someone or multiple people inside their home with a knife. It was a very brutal attack. And when law enforcement enters this crime scene, they immediately believe that this is a targeted attack. And that's the information that they put out to the community. They basically say that they're not sure whether it was one of the victims or multiple victims who were targeted, or if the house itself was targeted. But they do not believe that anyone else in this community is in any danger. So we're talking about 4 young people who were just brutally attacked and their lives were taken with a knife. But yet they're telling the community that they don't believe that anyone else is in any danger. Now, a few hours after law enforcement enters this crime scene, and before they have anyone in custody or any persons of interest, the University of Idaho puts out a vandal alert to inform the students of the University of Idaho that this crime has just occurred. And they basically tell them to shelter in place. Now, less than 45 minutes later, they post another vandal alert and they lift the shelter in place. They tell these students that it's fine to move around the campus, but just to be vigilant. So Moscow Police Department is basically saying that indications from inside this house led them to believe immediately that this was a targeted attack. So it's always made me wonder, what were those indications? Because I've always wondered if there was possibly something left behind, maybe something written on the walls or something like that, a clear indicator that this was a targeted attack, apart from just the sheer brutality of the attacks themselves. So obviously the investigation begins immediately, and Moscow Police Department begins canvassing the area for all security cameras, trying to look at all of the video footage of anything that may have been going on around the King Roadhouse at the time of the crimes, as well as before the crimes. Not only are they doing this canvass for security cameras, but other agencies are getting involved in this investigation. And of course, one of those agencies was the feds. They become involved almost immediately. Now, Moscow Police Department will come out and say in an interview that they contacted these agencies immediately because they knew that they were going to need the help. Moscow Police Department is a small department, and they knew that this crime was much bigger and that they were going to need a lot more resources. So the feds got involved almost immediately, and the investigation begins. Now, this is where it starts to get very interesting and also very confusing at the same time. So as they're looking at the video footage from the security cameras around the King Roadhouse, law enforcement discovers that there's a white 4-door sedan that seems to be showing up in a lot of this footage. So what they do is they send this footage to a vehicle identification specialist. And this specialist determines that this vehicle is a 2011 to 2013 white four-door Hyundai Elantra. So Moscow Police Department puts out a be on the lookout to all neighboring law enforcement agencies to be on the lookout for this white Hyundai Elantra. Now, on November the 29th, okay, 16 days after the crimes occur, two Washington State University police officers working separately. So they weren't working together. It's documented that they were working independently of one another. So one of these officers is going through the Washington State University database looking for any vehicles that might be registered to park at the university that are white Hyundai Elantras. And he comes across Bryan Kohberger's 2015 white four-door Hyundai Elantra. Now, this does not fit within the model year that they're supposedly looking for. But for some reason, this officer zeroes in on Bryan Kohberger's car. Now, we've been told that there were over 90 white Hyundai Elantras that were permitted to park in this area. But for some reason, this officer zeroes in on this vehicle. Now, 30 minutes later, another Washington State University police officer who's out driving around, who's out patrolling the area, comes across Bryan Kohberger's 2015 white Hyundai Elantra as well. So that's quite the coincidence, right? One officer at WSU is looking through the database and zeroes in on Bryan Kohberger's car. The second officer, 30 minutes later, just happens to run into Bryan Kohberger's car at his apartment complex. It's parked in the parking lot. So within 30 minutes, two officers from WSU working independently from one another both locate a white Hyundai Elantra. And it just so happens that this Hyundai Elantra belongs to Bryan Kohberger, who is also being monitored by the feds and has been since before he even moved to Pullman, Washington, allegedly. So it makes me wonder if the feds contacted Washington State University police and asked them to look for Bryan Kohberger's car. Not a white Hyundai Elantra, but Bryan Kohberger's white Hyundai Elantra. Because if they were monitoring him, then they would know that that is what he drove. Because it just seems odd to me that they were able to pluck Bryan Kohberger's car out of all of these students, not to mention law enforcement wouldn't even know that it was a student who committed these crimes, or it was a student who this car belonged to. This car could have belonged to anyone who lived in Moscow, Idaho, or Pullman, Washington, or even a surrounding area outside of that. They don't necessarily know that whoever committed this crime is a student or that they're students. It's very possible. It could have been just someone who lives there. But they zero in out of all of these people in these two towns, they zero in on Bryan Kohberger's car. It's like magic. But it makes me wonder if the feds contacted Washington State University police and had them locate Bryan Kohberger's white Hyundai. So here's where it starts getting odd, because not only do they locate this car, that at the time they have no idea that this white Hyundai, that this is the white Hyundai that was in any of this security cam footage. They have no idea. It's such a common car that they wouldn't have been able to confirm that this was the car in that video footage without a license plate or maybe a photo of Bryan Kohberger driving this car. But without knowing any of that information, they begin investigating this car as well as the owner. They go back and they look through the WSU database and they determine that it's Bryan Kohberger that owns this car. Now, not only does he drive a white Hyundai, but he's over 5'10", and he appears to have bushy eyebrows. So with a very, very limited description of this white Hyundai Elantra, with no distinguishing marks or anything that would set it apart from the other millions of white Hyundai Elantras, and a very generic description of the individual that Dylan Mortensen saw inside the King Roadhouse, they decide to elevate this investigation. They don't know that this is the car that they're looking for, and they don't know that this is the person that they're looking for. But they decide to elevate this investigation. And that's always made me wonder if they did this with every single white Hyundai Elantra that they found in this area. Because even if you found a white Hyundai Elantra, let's say, and it belonged to a female, you don't know that she didn't lend that car to her boyfriend or that her husband wasn't driving it. You know, this car could have been driven by anyone. But with all of this very limited information, they decide to elevate this investigation and they do a DMV search. Now let's go back to these two traffic stops that Bryan Kohberger had in August and October for very minor traffic violations. Now, investigators go back and they look at this body cam footage and they realize that Bryan Kohberger gives this deputy that pulled him over for not wearing a seatbelt his telephone number. Now, I've heard that there was a lot of friction there between Bryan Kohberger and this deputy because Bryan Kohberger was asking him, why do you need my telephone number? Now, I've talked to people and they've said that, you know, in some states, law enforcement does require your telephone number. I've never been asked for my telephone number when I've been pulled over because honestly, it's none of law enforcement's business what my telephone number is. And I'm sure that this is what Bryan Kohberger would have been arguing with this deputy about. But I've heard that this exchange became rather heated between Bryan Kohberger and this deputy. But Bryan Kohberger did give this deputy his telephone number. And investigators discover that when they're watching the body cam footage. So now they have Bryan Kohberger's cell phone number. And now they're investigating his phone information. So that escalated quickly because they still have very limited information about this car and about Bryan Kohberger. So this investigation appears to be moving along and escalating with just the information that Bryan Kohberger drives a white Hyundai Elantra and he's over 5'10" and has bushy eyebrows. So does that warrant this type of investigation? In my opinion, it does not, because there were probably multiple people who drove this car and fit this description. So why are they going all in on Bryan Kohberger when they don't know that this is his DNA on the knife sheath? They don't know that he was driving his car around the King Roadhouse that night. All they know is that he owns a white Hyundai and that he has bushy eyebrows and he's over 5'10". I mean, that's strange when you really think about it. Now, something else that's rather odd is that on December 8th, Moscow Police Department puts out a be on the lookout, and this time they do this to the public and ask for the public's help in locating this 2011 to 2013 white Hyundai Elantra. Now, of course, they flood their tip lines and they received 22,000 tips about white Hyundai Elantras. So there must have been a lot of white Hyundai Elantras in this area. But it just seemed odd that they put this be on the lookout out to the public with stock photos, no distinguishing marks or anything like that to help them identify this vehicle. They basically just put it out there, 2011 to 2013 four-door white Hyundai Elantra. Now, this is also 9 days after Washington State University police have located Bryan Kohberger's white Hyundai Elantra and have already began to investigate him further. So that seems odd to me because Moscow PD comes out and they say, we're looking for the occupants of this vehicle because we would like to talk to them. But when they locate Bryan Kohberger's car, they don't talk to him. They don't bring him in to talk to him. So why? Why wouldn't they question him at that point about his white Hyundai Elantra? They don't have anything that would identify Bryan Kohberger as driving this white Hyundai Elantra. So why would they be worried about scaring him off by questioning him? They wouldn't even know at this point that it was his DNA on the knife sheath. I mean, as far as they know, this is a 28-year-old PhD student that's going to school at Washington State University and working as a teacher's aide. He wouldn't have been that difficult to find if you wanted to talk to him. So why didn't investigators question Bryan Kohberger? You know, that's what they said they were looking for this car for, was to talk to the occupants. But then they find what they believe is this car out of some type of miracle, and they decide not to even talk to the owner of this car. So that's odd. Now, Bryan Kohberger's dad flies out from Pennsylvania, and on December 12th, him and Bryan Kohberger leave to drive back home to Albrightsville, Pennsylvania for the winter break in his white Hyundai Elantra. And along the way, Bryan Kohberger is pulled over twice in Indiana, both times for following the car in front of them too closely. Now, I realize that's a thing, but I can honestly say in all my years of driving, I have never been pulled over for following the car in front of me too closely. And Bryan Kohberger is pulled over twice in Indiana within a period of 10 minutes, both times for following the car in front of him too closely. And both times he's let go with a warning. So a lot of people have said that they don't believe that this had anything to do with the feds following Bryan Kohberger across country back home to Pennsylvania. But in my opinion, I will always believe that these two traffic stops were orchestrated by the feds. You know, maybe they lost Bryan Kohberger and they were trying to gather him back up. But it just seems odd to me that he gets pulled over for these two ridiculous reasons within 10 minutes of each other, and he's let go with just a warning. So Bryan Kohberger and his dad proceed on to Pennsylvania. Something else that's strange is that they don't let the lead investigator, Brett Payne from Moscow Police Department, know that they are investigating Bryan Kohberger until December 19th. Brett Payne testifies that he does not hear Bryan Kohberger's name until December 19th. But it's obvious that the feds had been investigating Bryan Kohberger since before December 19th, because that's when they called in the tip to tell Moscow PD that they should be investigating this guy. I mean, this is really strange. This whole investigation is odd because it almost seems as though the feds were conducting this investigation on Bryan Kohberger from the very beginning. On December 19th, the feds call in a tip to Moscow Police Department and tell their investigators that they should look into Bryan Kohberger because it is a very strong possibility that it is his DNA on the knife sheath. So obviously the feds have already been investigating Bryan Kohberger prior to December 19th. But on December 19th, they call in this tip. And this is when Moscow Police Department begins investigating Bryan Kohberger. So basically, they're going to begin a whole new investigation when the feds have already been investigating Bryan Kohberger prior to this. That just seems weird to me that the feds would say, you need to begin investigating this guy, Bryan Kohberger, when they already have been investigating him. They've already done an investigation on him. So why wouldn't they just share that with Moscow Police Department rather than just call in a tip and let them do the work all over again. So after they do this investigation, and of course we know that they dug the trash out of the Kohberger family garbage and they pulled a piece out that had Bryan Kohberger's dad's DNA on it, which to me, they already had Bryan Kohberger's DNA. You know, they told Moscow Police Department on December 19th. But yet on December 27th, they go through the trash, they get Bryan Kohberger's dad's DNA, they process it right away, and what do they determine? That he's Bryan Kohberger's dad. I mean, I feel like they already knew that he was Bryan Kohberger's dad. Did they really need his DNA? I mean, if they broke this down from a family tree and concluded that this was Bryan Kohberger's DNA through IgG on December 19th, then why would they need his dad's DNA on December the 27th? But for some reason, after they processed this DNA that they took out of the trash and determined that it was Bryan Kohberger's dad, they call Moscow Police Department and let them know that it was a match, that is Bryan Kohberger's dad. And at that point is when they decide to take Bryan Kohberger into custody. And on December 30th, he is taken into custody in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, at his parents' home. So if they started monitoring Bryan Kohberger in Pennsylvania, it all came around full circle. And they arrested him in Pennsylvania, where they began monitoring him. So this whole investigation, in my opinion, seems as though it was directed at Bryan Kohberger from the very beginning. You know, from the very, very beginning of these crimes, it seems to me as though these investigators were already zeroed in on Bryan Kohberger. And I think that that is what confused Ann Taylor. And that's why she was asking, what led you to my client? What led you to Bryan Kohberger? Because if they were already monitoring him before these crimes occurred and before he even moved to Washington, then what was the process that they used to lead them to Bryan Kohberger? Or were they already investigating Bryan Kohberger from day one? I mean, to me, the whole idea that they were monitoring Bryan Kohberger in Pennsylvania adds a whole new twist to this investigation, because obviously Bryan Kohberger was not a stranger to the feds. He was already on their radar. So it just seems odd to me that they keep kind of putting it out there as though they're following these leads, which these leads mean nothing. A white four-door sedan? I mean, that's not going to lead you to any one person specifically without a license plate or a picture of the driver. They have the IgG, but they're already investigating Bryan Kohberger before they have a confirmation on Bryan Kohberger's identification as far as the DNA on the knife sheath. You know, it just doesn't add up how Bryan Kohberger became part of this investigation in the first place. Let me know what you think in the comments, or if you have any suggestions about what you think about the feds already monitoring Bryan Kohberger in Pennsylvania and how that might play a part in this investigation. Thanks for hanging out with me today. I really do appreciate it. And if you liked my video, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to my channel. I hope that you all had an amazing day. We'll see you next time.